Well, this morning with the 12th grade boys class, we were talking about the familiar David and Goliath story, and and I asked them to go around the circle and just share what they knew. So each one of them told bits and pieces of it, and so we introduced the story of David and Goliath that way, and then we filled in a couple of points and blanks that they missed, and then we read the passage, and so there were several things that I wanted to talk about. One of the things that I asked was why is this story here in the Bible? Why is it here? And so there are multiple. There's a lot of things to learn, a lot of points to take from the story, and so I just want to talk about a couple of them. There's so many, but I'm just going to talk about the ones that I talked about with the guys yesterday. And so we asked the question, what's the point of this story? And in a generic sense, you can say you learn about God, and you learn about man, you learn about yourself, you learn about people, and of course everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. And so when you ask why is the story here, it's for those, at least those general things, and then there's some more specific things. And so those are the things that I want to point out, a couple verses, and then and just share some points. And so in 1 Samuel 17, you got the story of David and Goliath, and so Goliath and the Philistines are on the other side of the bank on a hill, and they're looking down and taunting the people of God, and Israelites are on the other side, and there it says in verse 11, it says that or verse 19, sorry, in verse 19, it says that I got verse 19, but then I'm looking at it, says at verse 11, when Saul and all of Israel heard these words from the Philistines, they lost their courage and they were terrified. So the word terrified, I think about the disciples. They were scared. Some of the things that they saw, namely when Jesus walking on the water, that scared them. And so, but you ask the question, why? Why did they lose courage? Did they not know how to fight? I mean, the obvious answer is they're looking at this nearly 13-foot human being down there, the Philistine Goliath, making fun of God. But then you ask a question. I mean, isn't God bigger than 13 feet? Right? I mean, isn't God bigger than that guy over there? Yeah. So why did they lose courage? Why did they become terrified? Did they not know the stories of God's deliverance from the past? This is the whole thing about discipleship, that they may have known some things about God, but they didn't connect the dots from what they had heard their ancestors say about God to their present life. They were unable to do that. And isn't that just like us today? We go to church and we sit there and we do not make the connection to out there in the world. We don't make the connection between the altar and the door. We don't. We walk out, and so many of us Christians, we're just anemic, and we're weak, and we're ill-equipped. And so here's these Israelites. They lost courage, and they were terrified. And so I asked the guys yesterday, and in our lesson, why? I mean, and I asked them, have you ever been scared and you wanted to speak up but you didn't? And one guy, only one, but he was brave enough in a safe environment, right? Sunday school class, to say, I've been through that. I remember a time when I wanted to speak up and I didn't. And so, the problem is we don't make the connection from what we are supposed to be reading in God's Word and what we hear, what we're supposed to hear from the pulpit on Sunday morning, what we're supposed to hopefully be able to hear from our parents, what we're supposed to hopefully be able to hear from someone who's discipling us and pouring into us and making us mature, walking with us so that we become mature. Somebody that we're accountable to, somebody who's discipling us, and we don't have that. We don't have enough mature believers who are out there discipling, pouring their life into younger believers. So the problem is that we don't know God, right? Somehow our image of God, or what we believe him to be, is limited to a place that we go and what someone else has said about him. And so, I asked a question. I made the point, nobody's convinced enough to say anything. All of Israel that was there, the soldiers anyway, that were there, none of them were offended. Think about that. These people of God who are supposed to be walking with God didn't know enough about him, didn't have enough of a relationship with him, that when someone lied about God, misspoke about God, taunted God, misrepresented him, what did they do? They just sat there and they had nothing to say. That's the indictment right there of us who say that we love God, say it's so, like, who am I to say that you don't love God, or somebody, doesn't love God? Okay, I get that. I don't want to say that. I wouldn't want to say that. But come on. Isn't there something that you know about God that's going to make you speak up? When they lie about God, when they lie about Jesus, when they misrepresent who he is, isn't there something in us that rises up? Is it too much to ask? Think of that, right? Is it too much to ask that when somebody says something that's wrong, that's not what the Bible says, when somebody says something that's not right about Jesus, not right about God, somebody says something that's not right, not what the Bible teaches about the Holy Spirit, when somebody says that, isn't there something in us? Is it too much to say that we ought to be speaking up at that point? And so many of us don't. And these people, that's what they did. There weren't any of them that were convinced enough about anything they knew about God to speak up. It's no wonder our churches are in the condition that they are. And the world thinks of us the things that they do. So here we are in 1 Samuel 17 and verse verse 11. It says, when the Israel heard this, that they lost courage and they were terrified. And I'm reading the story and I'm thinking about my own experience, and I'm saying there wasn't anybody who knew anything about God, convinced enough about anything about God to stand up and say something. Not one. What a shame. Somebody had to been or ought to have been offended, right? Some of the Israelites ought to have been offended that the Philistines, that Goliath would say what he said about a holy God. And instead, today we hear people talking all the time about they're offended by the most petty, indefensible things. And yet, here we claim to know God, to walk with Him, believe that He's going to take us to heaven rather than go to hell, but we don't have anything we won't stand up. We won't stand up for Him in the public arena where we work and where we live in our neighborhoods. So, and then verse 32, David said, don't let anyone be discouraged. Your servant will go. Right? Your servant will go and fight the Philistine. I'll go do it. I mean, there's got to be some point in our life. I'm trying to say this with a smile on my face, and because otherwise I'd just be yelling. But there's got to be some point in the Christian's life that they raise their hand and they say, I'll go. Right? Isaiah, send me. You know, I ask the question again, is that too much to ask? Right? Because you're not going to hell if you're actually saved, but you won't go to your neighbor. You believe you're not going to go to hell, in fact, that you are going to go to heaven, but you won't witness to your friend at work. That should really bother you. David, I don't know exactly how it played out, but he comes walking over the hill with a staff and a sheep following him, because that's what he was doing. He was tending his sheep, and he figures out what's going on. He hears the Philistine, and he says, wait a minute. Now, that's not right. How can he stand there and say those things about God? How can he stand there? How come you guys are standing there and not saying anything back to him? That's even worse than Goliath out there spouting out all these lies. All y'all standing over there not doing nothing about it. I'll go do something about it. And then everybody's like, nah, we done went down the list. We done went down the list of all the possibilities, and you're not on the list. Now, you too small. You're just a boy. You're just a lad. You're just a kid. You're a sheep herder. You're not a soldier. Everything about David said no. and all that the Israelites understood about what was going on said David's not the guy. And in fact, I'm going to let old Goliath over there keep spouting out stuff about this God I say I love. David, I suppose, like I said, I don't know how it went down, but I guess he comes walking over the hill, right? And he's got his staff and maybe a couple sheep following him. And he figures out what's going on. He's like, wait a minute. I'll go fight him. And so you ask the question, why? Why would he do that? And of course the answer is because he knew God. He was convinced. Like we're not. Like these Israelites, they weren't convinced. They didn't know anything about God. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it. I mean, they didn't know anything about God that they were so convinced about that they'd go fight Goliath. And so I think about my own life, right? And I think about, where I live and what I do, what I've done as a teacher and a coach. And I think, is there anything that I know about God that compels me, that I'm so convinced about, that compels me to share the love of God with people that I run into on a daily basis? What is there? Is there anything about God that, like John 6:69 says, when Jesus said to the disciples, are you going to leave me too? They said, no, we have come to know, and now we believe that you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. Something David knew about God gripped him to the point that he was compelled to stand up and say something. All right, so the follow-up question is, what grips you? What do you know about God that would compel you? I mean, maybe you're not. Maybe there's nothing you know about God that grips you, that compels you, that is down in the core of who you are, that you would rearrange your finances, that you would change your lifestyle, that you would step out of your cultural expectations about what it means to be a Christian. What? Surely there's got to be something. And so David in verse 32, he comes along and he says, I'll go fight that guy. Like Isaiah in Isaiah 6. Here am I. Send me. Send me. One of my favorite verses, Acts 20:22 through 24. Paul says, I'm compelled by the Spirit of God, even though he tells me that when I go to Jerusalem, there's going to be suffering and persecution. So I'm going. I'm compelled. And you read through Acts, and other people said, don't go. The Spirit has told us persecution awaits you there. Well-intentioned. Think about how many well-intentioned believers that you know. I don't know how mature they are. You should think about that. Right? I don't know how mature some of these believers are who so easily come up with these excuses why we shouldn't share the gospel, why we shouldn't go to the rest of the world when that's exactly where Jesus went. But we're happy with staying here. We're happy with our reasons and our excuses why we're not going to share the gospel. We're just going to go in on Sunday morning and sit and listen and live our really big life for God. So Paul said, I'm so compelled by the Spirit of God that I'm going to Jerusalem, even though I know that suffering and persecution await me there. And then he goes on in verse 24, I'm going to fulfill the thing that he put inside me to do. This is the message that everything I'm saying here, I said yesterday morning with the students, but what is God doing in you that compels you to do more than just, come to a building on a Sunday morning? Are you the kind of believer? Are you becoming the kind of believer who's going to do what God has put in you? Surely you're going to come to that point. If you hadn't thought about it, surely you're going to begin asking the question, what am I going to do? What do I believe about God? What do I believe about Jesus? What do I believe about the Bible that grips me, consumes me, and compels me to go to the world at any cost for the sake of the gospel? Because I have compelling reasons to believe that this book is true. Coherent reasons. Intellectually honest reasons to believe that this Bible is true, what it says is true, and therefore I'm going to give my life, I'm going to rearrange my life so that I can share that book and make disciples who are going to make other disciple makers. Surely that is just not, it can't be too much to ask. So here's David coming over the hill. He's got his shepherd, his staff, and he's probably got a couple sheep following him. He hears what's going on, and he's not going to sit by. He's going to speak up, and he's going to do something. I mean, that's what James talks about. You know, the book of James is a man saved because he does good works, or does he do good works because he's saved? And the latter is true. The former is not. You don't do good stuff in the hopes that you'll be able to have a saving relationship with God. You have a saving relationship with God, so you can't be quiet about it. You can't stay silent. You can't just not do something. This is why I always say, you know, if the Bible's true and we believe it is, and we have compelling reasons to believe that it is, we just can't remain silent. James teaches that. We see it in the life of the disciples. And here's David, who knows something about God. He's compelled. It wakes him up. I mean, that's the other question. You know, what is there that wakes you up about God? When you hear that these things about God that the Philistine is lying about, doesn't that stir your heart? Doesn't that wake you up? Doesn't it compel you to defend? I mean, that's what we're told in Titus in verse 3. Chapter 1, there's only one chapter in Titus. So in verse 3, you know, we're told to contend for the faith that was once handed down, and there's David. Now I want my name to be on that list. I want my name to be on the list that I contended for the faith that was once handed down. Not another gospel, but the one that was given to us through Jesus and that the apostles wrote down in the Gospels and the epistles. So the question I asked the guys yesterday is, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna refuse to waste any more of your life with just indifference and apathy, and just go to church and sit and listen and be good? What are you going to do in response to what we've learned? Acts 16:10, you know, it says there, it says that after Paul had seen the vision, he got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called him to preach the gospel to them. Right? You know, when I read that verse, I drew a line through Paul's name, and I wrote Brad. Because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to read this book and because we're compelled, because we're consumed with the glory of God, because we believe heaven and hell is true. We're going to share that with people. So I just wrote, after Brad had seen the vision, he got ready at once for wherever, concluding that God had called him to preach the gospel. So one of the last things we talked about yesterday with our 12th grade guys was, about today's battles. This was a battle between David and Goliath, and truth and lies, and honor and dishonor. And so, question is, what are today's battles that we face today? And we talked about a couple of them, but man, the biggest, greatest battle you fight is in here. It's not out there. The biggest battle that we fight is not out there. It's in here, in my head and in my heart, my character, my integrity. Am I really going to go to the world? Am I going to fight this battle and go to the world with the gospel? 1 John 4:4, greater is he that's within you than he that's within the world. Okay, well, it's either true or it's not. If I believe it's true, I can't keep acting like it's not and just continue to make excuses why I don't go anywhere and I don't share the gospel. Acts 1:8, you'll receive power and you'll be my witnesses. I understand that some people physically or for whatever, maybe really, I don't know, I want to use the word valid because I don't want to seem judgmental. But maybe there's really, really good reasons, and I understand that there are some, why people can't physically, maybe even mentally or emotionally go to the other side of the world. But, Acts says you're going to receive power. Most of us can go, but we don't. So the battle that we fight is I mean maybe the next time you hear someone talking about why they can't go or won't go. If they say they can't, maybe you can kind of maybe evaluate that in your head and maybe ask another question and see if it's really something that they won't do rather than something that they can't do. Because most of the battle is in here, in our head and our heart. We're not convinced and we don't know God enough like these Israelites didn't, and we become scared and we lose courage. So we concluded yesterday's lesson with the thought that, hey man, spend time in God's word, step out in faith and trust that God is able to do, like Ephesians 3:20, more than we're able to ask or imagine. He's always at work out there ahead of us. John 10:16, we know that he's ahead of us. He said so. And then start taking the gospel to the nation, starting with our neighbor, and ultimately developing a lifestyle where so this is another thing that I didn't mention here. I mentioned it yesterday, but one thing I just missed was that David, in the ebb and flow of his everyday routine of being a sheep herder guy, this opportunity presented itself. And it's like Acts 3:12, Peter saw his opportunity and he spoke. And then David, in the ebb and flow of his daily responsibilities of tending sheep, this opportunity to speak up for God and do something for God presented itself, and he took it. And this is what, my wife and I pray every morning before she leaves, and God, give us eyes to see what you're doing around us. Give us ears to hear what you're doing around us, and give us boldness, like the disciples prayed in the book of Acts. Give us boldness to step into what we see and hear you doing, and share the love of God with people. And so, in the ebb and flow of David's sheep herding daily responsibilities, this opportunity came up, and that's the same atmosphere that we find ourselves in. In the ebb and flow of going to work and doing our daily thing, cutting the grass, your neighbors walking by. I've been watching them since I've been talking here. I've been watching my neighbors walk by, and a couple of them stand out there talking. That's the opportunity that God gives us every day in our everyday occupation to share the love of God with people. So I pray this might be encouraging to you in your following of Jesus, and especially in your ministry of making disciple makers.